Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today let me introduce you to Hard Times by Charles Dickens. So Hard Times is going to be the 8th book in the Mega Dickens Readalong. If you don't know what the Mega Dickens Readalong is, I'll leave some more links down below. But basically, over the last year and a bit, a group of us have been reading Dickens's novels in chronological order, which has been really, really fun. We're now more than halfway through, and the book for February is going to be Hard Times. I'll leave down below the initial announcement video and also the Discord server, because if anyone is interested in joining in from this point onwards, or just for Hard Times, or catching up on what we've done so far, that's absolutely fine. You can join at any time. This is a very casual read along. But basically, throughout February 2024, we're going to be reading Hard Times. As always, for the Mega Dickens read along, there is no more set schedule than that. Start when you want, finish when you want. It is entirely up to you. We will, however, only be reading this one over 1 month rather than over 2 months, as we have been doing for quite a lot of the longer books, because as you can see, Hard Times is quite a lot shorter. In December and January, we read Bleak House, and in February, we will be reading Hard Times, which is quite a lot thinner than Dickens's usual novels. So today I just want to tell you a bit about Hard Times and give you 9 reasons, I think I've got 9 today, why you might want to read this book. So to begin with, what is Hard Times about? This book came out in 1854 and it is set in the fictional town of Coketown, which is a thinly veiled version of Preston. By most accounts, some people think it's meant to be Manchester, but most accounts seem to think it's meant to be Preston. Anyway, we follow, amongst others, a man called Thomas Gradgrind, who believes that facts are the only thing that matters. And we look at him and his family, and especially his 2 eldest children, Tom and Louisa, who he has brought up to believe in nothing but facts. There's also Josiah Bounderby, a businessman and mill owner in the neighbourhood, who, like Gradgrind, has a very particular view of the world. And these people and their attitudes kind of come into conflict with a little girl called Sissy Jupe, who turns up at a school that Thomas Gradgrind is kind of patronising. And Sissy Jupe's father works in the circus, and these people that think facts are the only thing that matters really have no time for the circus. So we kind of see these very different worlds collide, I suppose, in Hard Times. I am really looking forward to rereading Hard Times. It's a Dickens book that I don't usually count as one of my absolute favourites, but I also think it's one of his most interesting books. Like, it's quite a different one, and I feel like it's the kind of one that could go up a bit on a reread. Like, I say that I've read it lots of times already, but I feel like this will be one that I think carefully about when I do a new Dickens ranking at the end of the Mega Dickens Read Along, and I'm really excited to reread it. This will, I think, be the 5th time I've read Hard Times, but I've never listened to it on audiobook before, so that'll be really fun. So I studied Hard Times at university for 2 different modules. I actually did joint honours English Literature and History at university, and I managed to study Hard Times in both the English Literature half of my degree and the History half of my degree, which I think is very fun. So I studied Hard Times for an English Literature module, which was all about social critique novels and kind of condition of England novels, and that was fascinating. And then I was also doing a history module that same year that was on Victorian history, Victorian social history, and the module was called Hard Times because, you know, the Victorian age was pretty difficult for a lot of people, and we did a seminar on the novel Hard Times and what it could tell us about the history of the 19th century and the history of ideas in the 19th century. So that was fantastic, and maybe that is one of the reasons why I find Hard Times such an interesting Dickens book, because I feel like it's really interesting to look at from lots of different perspectives, I guess. Anyway, let me tell you my 9 reasons why I think you should read Hard Times. Reason number 1 is that Hard Times is Charles Dickens's only industrial novel, and it's his only novel set in the north of England. Charles Dickens, as a writer, is very famous for his depictions of Victorian London. He's an author who's really, really associated with London, and I'm pretty sure all of his novels, apart from Hard Times, are set at least partly in London. I say that, I'm trying to remember if they go to London in The Mystery of Edwin Drood, but I'm pretty sure that every other Dickens novel has a lot of the book set in London, even if parts of the book are set elsewhere. But in Hard Times, I'm pretty sure they never go to London. It is entirely set in the north in an industrial town called Coketown. As I said, Coketown is a fictional place, but it's modelled on Preston, with possibly a bit of influence from Manchester as well. And the way that Dickens writes about industry and industrialisation and about northern mill towns in Hard Times is really, really interesting. And if you're someone who has enjoyed other Victorian industrial novels, such as Shirley by Charlotte Bronte or or Mary Barton or North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, then I think you will really enjoy Hard Times and find it really interesting to look at in comparison to those books. In fact, I'd love to think more about the connections between Hard Times and North and South, because they were actually published serially in the same year, in the same magazine, Charles Dickens's magazine Household Words. So I think both Hard Times and North and South were published in weekly serialization form, and Hard Times finished in August, and then North and South started in September 1854. So Charles Dickens must have already been speaking to Elizabeth Gaskell about North and South and editing the early sections of North and South while he was writing the end of Hard Times, and that's just fascinating. Even just now, I opened my copy of Hard Times and it opened to chapter 5, which is a chapter called Men and Masters, and I know there's a chapter in North and South called Masters and Men. That's so fun. Anyway, that was a long tangent. The second reason why you should read Hard Times is that it is a really different Dickens novel. I would say it is the closest Dickens has to a sort of manifesto. Like, it's a book where he engages not just in social criticism, but almost like in philosophical criticism. Like, it's a much more political, philosophical book than his other books, I would say. Like, I would say that in general, all of Dickens's novels have a lot of social criticism within them, but I would say that in general in Dickens's book, the plot leads and the social criticism follows. Whereas I feel like in Hard Times, the social criticism, like the message leads and the plot follows and serves the message. A plot is still important in Hard Times, but I feel like it is a book where the criticism within it of society is kind of more to the fore and more the focus of the book. Kind of connected to that, the third reason why I think you should read Hard Times is because the themes in it are fascinating. And one thing Dickens does is set up a lot of like battles. So we have a battle between kind of like fact and fancy. Fancy being a word that Dickens uses a lot and that was used more commonly in the Victorian period to mean imagination. We also kind of have the battle between technology and imagination and how much these things might be in opposition. We have this kind of battle set up between the circus and the mill. We have this battle between sort of coldness and emotion, between reality and stories. And basically in a lot of Hard Times, Dickens is kind of picking apart utilitarian political economy and setting it up against individuals with feelings and emotions and imaginations, and that's fascinating. The fourth reason why I think you should read Hard Times is that some elements in it feel really, really relevant to modern concerns and to modern society. One thing that Dickens explores a lot in Hard Times is basically the fears of the industrialisation of the mind. You know, in Hard Times, Dickens is exploring the effects of industrialisation not only on the living conditions and the working conditions of people who are working in mills, but also he's examining the effects of industrialisation on the mind and the soul. He's saying, if we live in this society that is so reliant on machines, how will that change how people think? The more reliant we are on machines, the more people will try and think like machines. And for Dickens, that is horrifying. And that, I think, feels really, really relevant to modern concerns about technology and phones and AI and like how social media affects how people think. Like, I feel like a lot of the concerns about how technology is changing people throughout a lot of Victorian literature is something I find really, really relevant to modern concerns. So that's another really, really interesting thing to look for in Hard Times. The fifth reason why I think you should read Hard Times is that it is very short and it has a very different plot structure to Dickens's other books. Hard Times is much tighter, I guess, than other Dickens novels. Like, it just doesn't have the same kind of sprawling, massive plot structure with a slow beginning and a slow ending. It has a less like tied up ending. It has a faster beginning, and it is much tighter throughout. It doesn't have as many subplots and moving parts, and it's just a sort of tighter novel. I don't really know how else to describe it. It is much shorter than Dickens's other novels. I looked up the word counts for all of Dickens's books, which is fascinating. The longest one is David Copperfield at 357,000 words. I say that actually. David Copperfield is 5 words longer than Dombey and Son. So Dombey and Son and David Copperfield are the longest, and then more than half his novels are kind of over the 300,000 word mark. A Tale of Two Cities, 137,000, that's the second shortest, and then Hard Times at 104,000. In fact, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, Charles Dickens' unfinished novel, is 96,000 words. The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which is half a novel and is unfinished is a very similar length to Hard Times, which I find really interesting. You know, in general, Dickens's novels are a lot longer than we would expect novels published today to be, and have a very different plot structure than we would expect from novels today. But Hard Times is much more similar in its length and to a certain extent in its plot structure and its focus to novels that come out today. So that's a really interesting reason to read Hard Times. The sixth reason I think you should read Hard Times is one of the focal points of Charles Dickens's social criticism in Hard Times, and that is the way this book looks at the education system. So the very first chapter of Hard Times begins in a school, and Mr. Gradgrind says to the school teacher and the children, "Now what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life." And this book looks a lot at education and kind of to what extent education fails to serve the children who are being educated. There's a lot in this book about kind of childhood and education, what children are and aren't taught, again, fact versus fancy, and to what extent the like memorization of facts is any use to children at all, which is something I find really, really interesting in Hard Times, and again, does feel quite relevant. I feel like there's lots of discussion still in education about whether you're teaching skills or facts, and the way education is looked at in Hard Times is really interesting. My reason number 7 to pick up Hard Times is something else to do with social criticism, and that is the way this book examines marriage and also divorce, and kind of why people marry and whether it's really fair on either party that it's so hard to get out of marriage. Dickens is quite critical of marriage in other novels such as Dombey and Son, but in Hard Times he looks both at kind of how difficult marriage can be, but he also writes kind of quite powerfully about why the divorce laws are not sufficient, and that's something that's really interesting in Hard Times. And the 8th reason why you should read Hard Times is again to do with social criticism, and it's to do with the way Hard Times looks at trade unions and living and working conditions of people who are working in mills. It's another element that I find really interesting in Hard Times, and not a topic that Dickens necessarily often turns to, because as I said, in general his novels tend to be set in London and the South rather than in the North. And finally, the 9th reason why you should read Hard Times is for Dickens's wonderful, rich characterization. There are so many great characters in Hard Times. Louisa is fascinating, Gradgrind and Barnaby are well done, Stephen and Rachel are great, Sissy Jupe and the circus performers are really interesting, Mrs. Sparsit is hugely memorable for me, and there's just a lot of really interesting characters in here. I feel like Louisa Gradgrind, who is Mr. Gradgrind's daughter, is probably the character I find most interesting in Hard Times, and I'm really, really excited to encounter her again, and just to reread Hard Times and encounter all of the characters again. The final thing I wanted to say before I wrap up this video is just one thing to watch out for in Hard Times, which is that Charles Dickens has tried very hard to represent on the page the northern dialect of Stephen and Rachel and a few of the other mill workers, and especially some of Stephen Blackpool's dialogue is quite difficult to read. I'm actually really looking forward to listening to Hard Times on audiobook, which I haven't done before, because I feel like Stephen's voice will come to life much better on audiobook, but some of the stuff that is written in dialect is a bit tricky, so do take your time with that and consider an audiobook option as well. So I think that's all I have to say about Hard Times. I think it's a wonderful book and I'm really, really looking forward to reading it. Please do let me know down in the comments if you're joining in with Hard Times for the Mega Dickens Readalong this February. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.